You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
So I want to welcome to the program, again from the Heritage Foundation, we have James Sherk, and James is Senior Policy Analyst in Labor Economics. James, it's a pleasure to have you on the Final Say Radio Show. You're speaking with Brett and John Rappaport.
Thank you.
We've discussed the labor numbers. We get into the unemployment numbers and job growth and things of that nature. But I'd like to discuss a couple different angles with you today. When we look at the current state of our economy here in the United States, there seems to be a lot of reporting that the membership in unions is decreasing, but also I see a lot of interesting articles that would make me think that international unions are growing, and perhaps the unions themselves are starting to target different types of membership, such as, it seems like certain unions are pushing for legal immigration reform or immigration reform, where some of the unions are, now coming out against Obamacare. So there's a very interesting dynamics unfolding here.
Well, I don't think you're quite right. My understanding of the international figures are that you're seeing internationally the same thing you've seen in the United States over the past 40 years or so, and that's been a steadily shrinking union membership. That most people know in the United States, union membership has shrunk dramatically. In the private sector, it's just 1 out of 15 workers now belong to a union, and if you went back to the mid-1970s, that would have been about 1 in 4. And so you're a pretty sharp drop in union membership here, but you look at Canada, you look at France, you look at Germany, you look at the United Kingdom, you look at Australia, look at most developed nations around the world, and you're seeing a union membership falling. And I think the reason for that is because the modern economy makes the notion of a general representation and a collective contract a lot less appealing. You go back to the industrial economy of the 1930s when our labor laws were written, and you've got basically a whole lot of workers working on the assembly line, all doing essentially the same job. So having one contract that covers everyone and says you're all going to get paid this exact same rate for doing the exact same thing, it was a fairly workable system at the time. Well, a lot of those sort of repetitive jobs have been automated, and even within the manufacturing sector, it takes a lot more skills to do those manufacturing jobs, and a lot more individual and unique skills than was the case 2 generations ago. And so you've got an economy where individual talent, individual contributions, individual abilities are far more important to employers, and employees understandably expect to be rewarded for their contributions. But it's precisely that sort of economy that makes the notion of a general contract and general representation covering everyone and treating them exactly the same less attractive, not just to firms but to workers, because they want to be recognized for what they're bringing to the table.
It's very interesting. And I definitely recognize that union membership here is down, but I get so many emails from things that I actually thought that international union membership was rising. So it's amazing how good social media use could make things seem different from what they are. James, I have a question for you. When we look at today with regards to the overall employment in the economy, and are people who are working, are they better off today than they were, even just 5 years ago or 10 years ago or a couple of decades ago? Where are we today as opposed to some of the other administrations over the last couple of decades?
Well, those are 2 very different questions. In the short term, the economy has taken a huge battering. I think everyone recognizes this. The median income of U.S. households, so that's the income of the household right in the middle. Half of all households have more and half of all households have less. The median income of the typical U.S. household has fallen about 7% since the recession hit. And it's, I think everyone knows, been a painfully slow recovery, that unemployment is still at 7.4%, which is higher than anything we saw in either the 2001 or the 1991 recessions. It's painfully high unemployment. But you go back, say, 3 decades, 4 decades, and households are doing substantially better. And again, the median income of the U.S. households has risen a fifth between 1973 and today, and that's not counting the value of things like healthcare or 401k plans or other forms of non-wage compensation, which have become a larger share of workers' pay. Just looking at the cash wages, the median income is about a fifth ahead now of where they were a generation ago.
Well, James, there's actually, this is John, by the way, so you get to know our voices. There's two things I want to touch on. One, the first is, it feels to me, and I'm glad to hear that the international is more of a perception than a reality in the numbers, but it seems to me that even if the numbers are declining, it feels like the influence may be a little higher, a little stronger, a little louder, and I'll point to two quick items. One is, there seems to be, especially with people like the SEIU, a very strong push on supporting global emphasis on things like the Occupy movements, as well as things that violates state sovereignty and support UN supported issues. And the second thing would be the teachers union in particular, which seems to far outweigh its overall size because of the strong influence it actually has on the minds and the future voters as well as policy. So are the unions? So there's wrapped up in that is the question: Are we seeing if the numbers are dwindling, is the influence dwindling, or is the influence still remaining very strong?
Well, I think where the unions remain very influential is within government, that a majority of union members now work for the government. I mean, you say union, and most people think of someone in a hard hat working on an assembly line or maybe on a construction site somewhere. But that's really not the reality anymore. A majority of union members now work for Uncle Sam. You've got more than twice as many union members in the post office as in the entire domestic auto industry. And unlike in the private sector, I mean, what happened to General Motors? What happened to so many of these unionized companies, Hostess being a prime example, is that the unions negotiated contracts that made their companies less competitive. And so in the short term, you might have provided some benefits to the workers, but in the long term, a lot of them lost their jobs. I mean, even at General Motors, where they got the bailout, but even with the bailout, General Motors only has half as many unionized employees today as they did in 2005. And so in the private sector, unions have shrunk dramatically. But there are no competitive forces in government. I mean, Detroit and California are testing the theory that governments don't go bankrupt. But generally speaking, if the government does an inefficient job providing services and serving the taxpayers, it doesn't go bankrupt. It can just charge more to voters in the form of higher taxes. And so in government, unlike the private sector, union membership has remained more or less steady. And it's in government where you see these pension plans that are putting such strain on so many state budgets, like in New York and in Chicago, and recently in Detroit in the news. And I mean, you take a look at the school system where you've got, I mean, it's virtually impossible to fire a teacher in those states for poor performance, and it's virtually impossible in most states to reward a teacher for excellence in the classroom and doing a great job helping kids, because you've got these union negotiated seniority systems and job protections that to some extent are in the institutional interest of the union, but are not at all in the interest of either the good teachers or in the interest of the students who want to learn from the best teachers. And I think in government their influence remains strong, and it's not a healthy influence.
Well, it's actually one of the biggest concerns I have, because TSA is a perfect example of it. TSA came out of nowhere and immediately empowered an entire, I forget what the numbers are, but it was somewhere in the 50 to 75,000 range, I think, all of whom, of course, were instantly unionized. So the obvious question that comes out of that would be, after Obamacare achieves its ultimate stated goal, which would be a single payer, and the government truly takes over the whole thing, isn't that to some degree maybe a hidden payback to the unions to say, hey, you may have lost the manufacturing union scale, but don't worry, when the government takes over a lot more, we'll have these new enormous government unions?
Well, I think that's exactly it. I mean, when they first passed TSA, the decision had been not to unionize it because there were concerns about safety risks to passengers. And there was a case in Canada where in Thanksgiving, the union, obviously they're not allowed to strike, but what the union decided they were going to do instead was simply, it's called work to rules. They were going to inspect every person's bag, everything out thoroughly. And you had massive pileups and delays in Thanksgiving weekend, so much so that the managers were just forced to let 250,000 passengers just be basically through with no screening. Now, you can't have that happen. You can't have the union work stoppages and work slowdowns causing people simply not to be screened. I mean, it's a vital national security position. I mean, lives are potentially at risk there. We don't have the airport screeners here simply for the fun of it. We have them there because we don't want terrorists getting guns or bombs on the planes. And if you've got these sort of work slowdowns, that's potentially what could happen. And that's why initially the decision had not been to unionize TSA. And it wasn't until after heavy lobbying by the union that ultimately organized TSA that the Obama administration changed its mind and decided that the initial policy that had been put in place when the TSA had been announced was going to be switched. And I mean, it's absolutely a growth field for them. And what's interesting is seeing just how creative they're getting in terms of defining government employees. You now have a number of states where what they're doing is Medicaid in most states will provide parents or family members looking after a disabled child or a disabled relative a subsidy to basically help them afford the cost of taking care of that relative at home, which actually saves the government and taxpayers money because they don't have to basically send them into an institution for institutional care, which is far more expensive than the subsidy they provide to the families, and it allows the parents to afford to have one parent, not working full time and spending time with the disabled child, or the disabled family member. So it's a win for both the family and for the taxpayers. But what you've had unions doing in a number of states is getting executive orders passed that define these parents taking care of their disabled family members as state employees, unionizing them, not allowing the union to negotiate over anything whatsoever, except one small provision, and that provision would be the union can negotiate to have dues automatically deducted from the checks from the Medicaid reimbursement checks of the parents looking after their disabled relatives. And these sorts of schemes account for almost all of the SEIU, one of America's fastest growing unions. Almost all of their net membership growth over the past decade comes from doing things like organizing parents taking care of their disabled relatives and then forcing them to pay dues. And you listen to the parents you're talking to this. I mean, there's a father in Michigan complaining, look, I'm giving you guys your $40 a month. Could you at least come over and do some babysitting so my wife and I can have a night off? I mean, what am I getting for this? It's absolutely outrageous.
James, in the last few minutes that we have with you, I have a two-part question. One is, are we seeing a change in our economy, and partially due to the economy itself and partially due to the healthcare law which has passed, but do we see more part-time workers today? And then if we look at, I've noticed strikes around the country in places like New York and some other cities with some of the fast food restaurants. And, are we going to have a change in that particular industry as they're seeking to unionize and significantly increase the wages that are paid in those types of operations?
Well, we've certainly seen an increase in part-time employment. I think it's too soon to attribute that to Obamacare. That this is something that happens in most elections, in most recessions, and that it's. You wouldn't expect employers to start putting people on part-time status before the penalties take effect. Now, we are hearing anecdotally a lot of talk about employers who plan to restructure their workforces, but I don't see that you can see it in the data yet, or at least anything you can distinguish from the overall increase in part-time employment that you often see in a recession. Now, on the issue of the fast food workers, I'm skeptical we're going to see much of a big union push in that industry, simply because most workers who work in the fast food industry aren't there for very long. The median age of a fast food worker is about 23, 24 years old. It's something that a lot of people will do while they're in high school or a part-time job while in college, and then when they get out, they move elsewhere and take a full-time job that pays more. For most workers, not all, so certainly not all, but for most people in the fast food industry, it's not something they're looking to make a career out of. And I think most people would say that's a good thing. We want people to have higher paying opportunities and better job opportunities available. But when you've got something that's such a transitionary state for most people in there, and especially in an industry where consumers are so cost conscious. I mean, McDonald's has been trying to move people into this third pounder Angus burger, and they've announced they're going to take it off their menu simply because the consumers weren't willing to pay the extra money for it, and most people were still ordering off the dollar menu. And so it's a very cost-sensitive industry. Where why do you go to fast food? Because you want it quick and you want it cheap, and you're not trying to get quality. And so if you actually did see wages double in the industry, you'd probably see a pretty sharp shift in employment away from those companies that got unionized and towards those that weren't.
All very good points. And James, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Great information on a lot of different areas within labor and economics for us. So again, thank you so much. How could people follow you?
We put all our research online at www.heritage.org. Again, that's www.heritage.org. So you can find my research and the research of my colleagues here online.
Okay, excellent. Again, James, thank you so much. James Sherk with the Heritage Foundation, policy analyst in labor economics. Thanks again, James. Bye.